My personal belief is we've seen our cities and towns around Greater Manchester really benefit from the cultural renaissance. The Manchester I first arrived at 30 years ago was a very, very different Manchester than the one we see today. And we've seen in many ways artists and culture the vanguard of the urban revolution. They're the first people who occupied places like the Northern Quarter or Ancoats in Manchester or other places. And from there, the regeneration flows forward. Culture affects the quality of life. All of us are looking for inward investors, inward investment. And of course, the price of offices and the availability of factory and the quality of the workforce are all very important. But ultimately, individuals make the choices. Chief executives, chair people of big companies, and they're looking for good homes, good schools, good sporting facilities, and great culture where they can come and enjoy. So today we're talking about Salford and Bolton, two great places in Greater Manchester. Urban Splash have worked in both of those very successfully. We have got a stunning panel to talk to us about it. So I'm going to introduce them going around in this order. First of all, in fact, just before I do that, at the end of this, we want to have very short presentations from everybody, 3 minutes, and then we want you as the audience to ask plenty of interesting but not too difficult questions from our esteemed panel, if we can, please. So without further ado, can I introduce you to Stephen Young, who's Director of Place at Bolton Council. Stephen.
Okay, yeah, I mean, obviously the question around culture and why it's important in terms of regeneration is really, really pivotal. If using as the Bolton example, over the last few years in Bolton, we've had about £1 billion of inward investment, and about a quarter of that's been in the town centre. And a key part of our strategy around the town centre has been really focusing on culture and creating a really vibrant town centre where people want to live and work. I mean, we've been working with partners like Morgarth at the Marketplace, who've done a fantastic job to bring a real cultural offer to complement the shopping offer, which is really helpful in terms of taking the next steps towards improving our housing offer. We work with people like the Octagon Theatre and Bolton Egyptology Collection, which again are really, really important cultural assets to the town. And as a result of that work, we're starting to see inward investment, particularly around housing, and people starting to want to live and work in the town. In addition to that, the council is really proactive around the number of major events that we sponsor every year, the Food and Drink Festival being the obvious one and the biggest one. And obviously really pleased today to announce the lineup for next year's Food and Drink Festival, where we're expecting about 250,000 people to engage in that cultural activity. So this year we're really pleased that we've got Michael Keynes, who'll be taking part on the Friday. We've got Simon Rimmer doing the Saturday. We've got Ainsley Harriott doing the Sunday, and we've got James Martin, the festival favourite, doing the Monday. And again, you know, really, really important in terms of improving cultural life in Bolton.
Thank you very much. My mouth is watering just thinking about that. Bolton, let's have it. And then on to Julia Fawcett, OBE, who's the Chief Executive of the Lowry on Salford Quays. Actually, my first house I ever lived in was on Salford Quays, and it was just next to the Copthorne Hotel. And there were literally 7 houses there and absolutely nothing else on the whole of the Quays. It was a barren wasteland, and now look at it. A large part of that is due to the Lowry. Tell us a bit about it, Julia.
Okay, before I do, I'm going to ask you to indulge me a little. Close your eyes. Think about the most amazing place that you know, wherever it is. Just think about it, and then think about the features that make it so fantastic. Okay, open your eyes. I don't know what you were thinking about, Paris, London, Salford, Manchester, wherever. I bet all of those places had one thing in common. I bet they all provide incredible, fantastic quality of cultural experiences. Tom talks about his first house being based down at Salford Quays and there being not very much around it. Well, I actually grew up in Salford, and my home and my school and my college was on the side of what was, at that point in time, working docks. In fact, the 3rd largest docks and port in the country. And then we all know what happened through the course of the 70s and 80s. The docks closed down. It was interesting when I was growing up. The working docks were known as Manchester docks. When they closed, they became known as Salford docks. There's a story to that. But they were left to effectively to fall into dereliction. And obviously there were plans and aspirations. Nothing could quite gain traction until the local authority came up with an idea, a cultural regeneration project, which was the Lowry, my own organisation. And it was one site, one location within the breadth of that urban derelict industrial wasteland with contaminated dock basins. And yeah, it took a lot of grit and determination, partnership working, which Greater Manchester, as you know, is well known for, to invest, to find the money, to invest, to get the sticking power, to realise the ambition of a £116 million culture palace, not a white elephant, a place for people in our city to identify with and something to act as an emblem for the hopes and dreams of the city of Salford. So there we are, £116 million of investment 17 years later. If you were at the session earlier today, you'll have heard our City Director Jim Taylor talk about us being the cornerstone of a regeneration that now delivers more than £1.4 billion of GVA each year, and culture, placemaking sitting right at the heart of it. Tom also just said that artists are the first people to move into these places. Of course they're not. What's culture for? Who is culture for? All of these places had people, citizens, communities already there. And I think what's really important about cultural projects and defining successful cultural projects are ones that embrace newcomers, the inward investment, the businesses, the new people moving into our communities, and at the same time make those places that we're creating open, accessible, and meaningful for our local communities. And I think, the Lowry's a great example of how projects can act as a stimulus for economic investment, can act as a cultural icon for existing communities, and represent great cultural meeting points for new development and new meeting of communities to take place.
Thank you very much. Out of interest, how many people have been to visit the Lowry in Salford Quays? Put your hands up. Hey, what a culture bunch we have in the audience. The rest of you, get down there, you're going to enjoy yourselves. On now to Ian Thompson, Group Partnership and Communications Manager, that's a snappy title, of Harworth Estates. Harworth came out of the old UK coal company, working in some quite challenging areas. Areas are not necessarily renowned often for culture. Ian, tell us a bit about what you're doing.
Morning everyone, I'm going to keep this mercifully brief. I've only got 3 minutes anyway. So how does brownfield land development link in with culture? Well, Tom frankly has stolen my thunder because it relates in two ways. One is house builders want places aspirational to, in effect, buy land from. So they want good quality ancillary facilities on the doorstep. Occupiers, like the ones we've got at Logistics North in Bolton, they also want good quality facilities to encourage work-life balance amongst their employees, whilst tacitly implying that healthy employees are actually more productive, so it makes them more money ultimately in the end. I also want to stress that if you don't offer those kind of facilities, it doesn't constitute high-quality development, or the sort of development that you should be promoting in the south of France anyway. So how does that relate to Logistics North? We're developing a 550-acre country park that we're promoting for sport and leisure uses, which will have cycle trails, running trails and so on, which we are in effect learning from our development at Waverley in South Yorkshire, which is Yorkshire's largest ever brownfield redevelopment. We've got the advanced manufacturing park, we've got a 4,000 home development going on next door. So we want to try and take the learning from there, where you've got employees from Rolls-Royce, Boeing, local residents actively using those facilities. And frankly speaking, ladies and gents, I'm the physical embodiment of that, because 9 months ago, I was looking distinctly jowly, 40.5 stone. I started actually actively using our facilities, and look at me today, 3 stone lighter, so it does actually work. One thing that I will say today is that we're very, very keen to try and exploit the public open space a little bit more. So it's very, very easy to developers just to, in effect, just do basic development, put trails in and so on, without thinking about either technological upgrades or any kind of links with universities. And we've actually signed a partnership with Sheffield Hallam University to try and make the most of the 350 acres we've got at Waverley in Rotherham, to try and make the most of that. And ideally, what I'd like to get from MIPIM, or at least following on from MIPIM, is some kind of technological partnership with one of the Northwest universities to try and do the same thing, to try and bring some innovation to public open space. So that is how culture relates to our brownfield development anyway.
Thank you very much, Ian. On to Fak Farouk, Managing Partner of Shoesmiths. All these things need to be documented and need to get legal agreements, and so often, in our experience, the nice bits get written out at the end of it. How do you make sure it all happens, Fak?
That's right. Thanks, Tom. I've not yet used Ian's facilities, as you might guess, but I know what you were thinking. Yeah, the boring bit, Tom, but culture, we've heard this morning, the Brexit debate, how populism and nationalism needs to be addressed in the context of Europe, etc. And one of the things that came out of that debate was about how we can actually address those problems with what people want. And culture is absolutely vital to create those vibrant, sustainable communities. And I actually I think it's worth just defining, Tom, how I see culture. Culture for me is about well-being. So it's not just about arts and theatre, it's about general well-being and how that can actually address those problems that we're suffering in Europe today. So well-being being things like sports, leisure, as well as the arts and theatre. So definition of culture is very important. But how do we all accept that culture is important, it's to create those vibrant communities. But what we need to do, in my opinion, is put culture at the top of the agenda. I'm not sure it is at all times at the top of the agenda. So infrastructure, transport, absolutely at the top of the agenda, but culture should be akin to those areas. But yeah, absolutely. Tom asks, how can we pay for it? How can we actually make this happen? My view is by putting it at the top of the agenda and being creative on how we can actually get those cultural additions into, for example, Section 106 obligations from developers and also local authorities funding it directly. Now, I know what you're all going to be saying, particularly in the M60 towns, the developers' viability issues, they can't afford it, local authorities can't afford it. But my view is, and I've seen this in Bolton, if you get creative, the developers get creative, and the local authorities get creative, and you put it at the top of the agenda, we can actually make a difference. We can make a difference in making new communities. We can make a difference in actually addressing the problems we've got in the UK and Europe-wide. So I think, in summary, Tom, I think a dollop of creativity, putting it at the top of the agenda, and a bit more gust on focusing on issues, cultural issues and well-being issues, rather than just the transport infrastructure issues that we traditionally focus on, and we can make a difference.
Thank you very much, Vac. It's much more interesting, take it from me, talking to artists than transport engineers. No disrespect to any transport engineers in the room today. Over to Stephen Wild, Managing Director of Media City. Media City is full of creative industries, and also, increasingly as you go around the space there, all sorts of interesting happenings going on in the square, what do you call it? In the piazza. We're in France, we can talk about piazzas. Stephen, you've got big investors, Peel and Legal and General, as I understand. How do you make this happen and manage it with their expectations of return?
Right, to start with, I had to be careful knowing that Tom was going to be chairing this when I wrote how long ago I think that culture wasn't intertwined with development. I think many decades ago, if you went back, culture was just not thought of in regeneration schemes. I think as we've moved from a manufacturing base into a creative environment, this has been much more intertwined with looking forward, looking at the schemes. Talent, none of these businesses can exist without talent. And if you take Media City as an example, where we're creating a hub there, we've got creative companies, we've got animators, we've got TV companies, gaming companies. All these are led by creative and people. And interestingly, if you go and speak to them, they want to be in an environment which is similar to that ethos. They want to be creative, they want to live, they want to work, they want to visit in an environment which really, really rings with them. And that becomes pretty self-fulfilling for businesses in terms of wanting to attract that talent, and there is a shortage in that bit, in saying, well, OK, we need to be in an environment where they can live. Tom, you can't look at your watch. We're going to be about 30 seconds. OK. You then said, how is it delivered? Now, I have to sort of shy away from the Section 106 side. I'm not sure I quite like that. Partnership models is how this is delivered. So down at Media City, we're very lucky. We have the Lowry Arts Centre. Julia's outlined what they do there, but actually, we have something called the Keys Partnership there, and what that delivers is some of the leading digital installations which then go on tour around here, animating the spaces down there. Obviously, we've got the sort of slightly razzmatazz of the BBC and ITV in there as well, which gives us a real blend. And it's important that culture is very, very broad and it needs to fit everybody. So you will see things at Media City ranging from the Manchester International Festival, which we hosted elements there, down to a triathlon, down to Gok Wan, stripping for summer, which certain people on this panel don't consider to be culture, but some of us do. But it needs to appeal to everybody here. And therefore, you need a very wide range of events and such like there. I think it's also important, the engagement with, particularly Salford City Council, but with the local authority across piece. We need to be very careful in regeneration that they don't just land from Mars, these schemes. And there's a whole population who've been there long before, who need to be engaged in this, need to want to go there, need to engage there, and it can drive aspiration in those bits. So you then touched on the spaces. Yes, now in France is the Piazza just today. You know, what goes on between the buildings is probably as important, if not more important, than the buildings themselves. And so it's very important we just don't build spaces which don't get used. It's therefore important we look from day one, where's the infrastructure, where's the power, all the boring things, even where's the transport coming in. But you've got to be able to get these so they operate properly in there as well. How's it driven the Keys? Well, I think the Keys and Media City has now become a huge, vibrant visitor destination. Obviously, BBC, ITV have helped that, and the profile's raised. But we've not stopped there. So we've recently got consent for phase 2, effectively, but another 2 million square feet. There's a whole range of spaces in there, not looking to compete with the Piazza space we've got or step space we've got, but completely different, that they can be used different ways and can actually be given over to the community to say, OK, you use them as you want to use them.
Thank you very much.
That's nearly on time.
Perfect there. And over to Sheila McNerney, Head of Development, Salford City Council. Salford's not always been synonymous with culture, but increasingly we're seeing many, many more interesting things happening in the city. Tell us about some of them, Sheila.
We are. Thank you, Tom. I think we've established that we all love art and culture. We always have a debate about what is culture. I think, Tom, it was you who said that it's everything that we do when we're not working or sleeping. So that is a lot of stuff. I think it's what makes us human, you know. We've got paintings, experiences, performances, events, festivals. We've got gardens. We've got the Royal Horticultural Society garden investing in Salford. So I think the message that I want to get across in just a couple of minutes is this is what makes us human. If investors and developers are also human, then what I would say to you is that you do get this. This is not about investing in individual sites anymore. We heard debate this morning, we've heard debate yesterday, and we'll hear it for the rest of the week. You're investing in our city. You're not investing just in very tightly drawn red lines around individual sites. This is a challenge for all of the professionals involved in the property industry and in the investment industry. But there is such momentous change in our cities. Salford and Bolton are part of that Greater Manchester transformation. The story of the last 30 years is well rehearsed. What we're concerned about now is what happens next. What are the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years? The culture and creative industries have become an economic sector in their own right. So we feel protective of some of the creative individuals in our city who run businesses. The creative content of events like this, the photography, the digital production. There are hundreds and hundreds of people in industries, which are the creative industries that make all of this possible, and we're at the front of it. But let's look at where they're working. I think the other message is around the end users in some of our financial and professional services in our city centres are really interested in this, that talent recruitment, young urban population. They're looking for what is the cultural and creative life of the place they're going to work in. So I suppose the last thing is the challenge in Salford is we would say to you as investors, work with us and help us solve some of these really difficult problems. Why should ground floors be left vacant any longer? Even if we've got a construction project for some years, let's get those interim uses in. Let's get a density of activity as well as a density of construction. And I think we would say to you, we want you to get involved in our city and the cultural life of our city. This is about talent and this is about how our cities grow. We've done a huge amount around the first phases across the whole of Greater Manchester. The first phases of Media City done. The BBC have been there for more than 5 years now. The first phases of New Bailey, the first phase, it's the second phases. And our second phases need to actually be better quality than the first phases. So that's the challenge I would put out to the industry.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you all of you for being so brief and to the point. We now have the fun bit, time for questions, comments, to either the panel in general or any individual people. Just if you'd like to ask a question, stick your hand up, say who you are and fire away. Who would like to ask a question? We've got a question over here. We're going to come and see. I'm the able assistant with the roving mic. Just say who you are first.
Hi, Tom Stannard from Oldham Council in GM. I think just a general point, building on the last point that's just been made really about the second phase of all of this, really important we get an offer together that showcases the collective cultural offer of city regions at large, I think. And I think Stephen's point about the Octagon in Bolton, we've got a 50 million programme for a brand new Oldham Coliseum Theatre, Heritage and Arts Centre coming through in Oldham over the next 2-3 years, linking in with all of the stuff we've achieved collectively, I think, in the Lowry. So some comments, reflections on how we best kind of put that collective cultural offer for the whole of a city region as a place, I think is really important. And particularly because those are the assets often in that second phase, I think, that local populations have most definite attachment to in some of our smaller towns in and around Greater Manchester.
Thank you for that. Other questions?
Kai Bergman with Big Architects. I would like to also talk about maintenance, because oftentimes there's so much effort and work put forward to actually creating these cultural opportunities, but then very little work done in actually talking about how to maintain them. And many of these cultural investments sometimes falter because the maintenance is in one way an afterthought.
Okay, I'm going to do one more question, then pass back to the panel.
Thank you, Tom. Hello, Henry Brooks from the Tatton Estate. I'd like to ask, how can the planning process really embrace this kind of agenda from the very outset? How can we have local plans that have 3 dimensions, not 2, and not just dedicate housing zones and employment zones, but encourage places?
So a number of very interesting questions, and I think the Oldham point was interesting, and the GM point is interesting as well. As we come from Manchester to Greater Manchester, many of the people, apart from elected politicians, don't really care where the borders are, what lives in there. Is an opportunity here to have a more unified offer. What do we do about the maintenance and looking after the assets in the long term? And how can the planning process help these things? Let's go in reverse order, start with Sheila, go back with any comments on any of those 3.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge in the planning process, and it's certainly something we're looking at in Salford actively. So we're developing a cultural strategy. We don't want that to be another strategy, another separate document. It's like really understanding what is the east, west, what is media city, what are the cultural strengths of these places in our cities, and how does that get shaped in our ask of developers and investors at the current time? So that's something we're actively looking at. I don't think all of this can be answered through statutory planning processes as such, because culture bleeds through all of it, doesn't it? But I think architects and professional teams working for developers and investors have a really important role to play in terms of the quality of design, what sort of places we're creating. There's a big expectation around flexibility at the moment. So we're always looking at, well, we're going to design it for this now, but it needs to transform into something else in the future. So it's designing in to places. Where are there going to be small businesses? Where are there going to be artists? Why can't we have artist studios cheek by jowl with corporate investment? You know, if we leave it to the market, then it gets pushed out. So I think all of those questions are difficult to answer in a soundbite. But I think what we're doing is trying to work through how do we embed this in new ways. And it's about innovation as well. So I think it links a little bit with the maintenance question, because for me, I'm quite interested in how do we get the right sort of operators for this cultural activity? How do we curate it across our cities? It doesn't just happen on its own. Some of the best case studies are where you've got some really innovative individuals who are going to make this whole thing happen. So I'm sure others have got plenty to say as well.
Stephen?
I think if you to pick up the Oldham point, if we're going to maximise the potential that we have, whether you put it in a Northern Powerhouse environment or whatever it is, whilst I personally might like to think that everybody's going to buy apartments and work within the 37 acres that is Media City, it ain't going to happen. So therefore, we draw, if you look at the travel to work areas and such like now, it's already pulling on all those GM areas and slightly beyond. And therefore, if we want to attract that talent, we need to make those places equally attractive in there. That will obviously cause a bit of a friction with the commercial activities wanted in other areas as well. But then it ties into sort of bits Ian picked up on in terms of the quality of life, the environment, the schooling and all this stuff. So it has to be seen across the board. If we don't, we won't maximise the potential in there. In terms of maintenance and such like, I think we might leave Julia to answer that one. She seemed to be in charge of one of these. The planning process, goodness knows. What it's got to do is start to ingrain a cultural strategy within the planning policy, and seeing that if that is delivered, that is part of, this is almost planning gain type approach in a way that it's delivered. And it's not an afterthought. It has to go in at day one. And I think that needs thinking through and how you put that in policy.
I'm going to come back to you, Shia.
Just to address the maintenance point, a really interesting point about how we can actually maintain it and ensure there's a legacy there. And I think it's all about the setting of the priority. If we put culture and everything we need out of culture as a top priority, then what I'd like to see is local authorities and developers working together to set up legacy accounts to make sure that whatever we design up front, whether it's leisure centres or other cultural projects, Sheila mentioned the artist studios, there's actually something in the bank there in perpetuity, a mechanism. It's going back to creativity to make sure that it's all there up front. Now, I'm not proposing that we increase payments from developers through Section 106 or likewise. I'm proposing as an alternative to transport contributions, as an alternative to, I don't know, POS, that we actually put that money into cultural projects and actually ensure that there's a governance procedure there going forward as well. I think if we focused on governance of, say, Sheila mentioned the artist studios, to make sure they stay artist studios in perpetuity rather than being sold off for expensive office space in the future. So it's really about governance and maintenance being set up in partnership up front between developers and local authorities.
Shia.
So I just wanted to add something about that planning and culture question and discussion, because it occurred to me one of the first things that they did in London when the mayor came in was establish a head of culture. So it's making me think around Greater Manchester and the new GM mayor and where culture will fit across GM, just alongside transport, infrastructure, policing, housing, but culture. And again, that would be a way of really looking at what the cultural role and function is of each of the areas around the city.
Two very brief but salient points. Can everyone hear me, by the way? No, it's just come on. Right, maintenance. Maintenance of public open spaces should be considered in exactly the same way as the maintenance of business parks. It should be part of day-to-day expenditure, and that's generally the way that we look at things anyway. However, the key to the ongoing maintenance and use of places is to encourage its patronage, which is why I was exactly talking about technology use, is to encourage people to use the facilities in the first place. And so the kind of spin-off from that are things like social enterprises and then the things being locally owned. So people have got a stake within those particular developments. That's absolutely critical. The other point, which Henry regularly raises questions about placemaking, I'm glad he does. I mean, from my point of view in terms of the planning process, at the very least, for housing and employment developments, because of the cheap by gel, so one keeps pace with the other. I think I've seen too many areas across the UK where there is a disconnect between housing numbers and planned employment development. And that, at the very least, needs to be addressed.
Yeah, just the Oldham question about how we articulate the cultural offer for Greater Manchester. I think, without a doubt, my sector, the arts and culture sector itself, needs to get better at that. We have found it a real challenge historically as a sector to argue for the benefits of culture, particularly outside the intrinsic benefits that, as artists and people working in arts organisations, we feel is such a powerful tool and story in their own right. But I know across Greater Manchester, arts organisations like those in Oldham, Bolton, Rochdale, Salford, Manchester, we are increasingly working together now to commission evidence-based narrative that allows us to articulate what each of those districts is bringing to the party. And we all do bring very different things to the party. And, the mantra at the moment, very much stronger together. And, when we've got that joined up cultural offer and proposition as a sector, then I think it would make it easier for any organisation in whatever local authority across GM to articulate better for that kind of investment that supports the maintenance and sustainability of each of our institutions.
Absolutely agree with the points that Sheila made around kind of a cultural lead across Greater Manchester. I think it was the point that you made, Tom, that artificial boundaries are really irrelevant when you're talking about culture. It's really important for Bolton that we have a strong Lowry, we have a strong Manchester cultural offer, and also absolutely want to echo Ian's points around maintenance. I think those are really salient and important points.
And we've got time for 2 or 3 more questions. Any questions? Just say who you are first.
Mike Wilton from Arup. A couple of points. One is no one's talked about mental health And I think there's a real strong role about mental health and stress reduction, how culture can be a really important part of that as part of the broader GM health agenda. And the other area being touched on slightly, which I think is very important, is about sport and the role of sport amongst culture and how that relationship, if you look about what most people do if they're not working or sleeping, they're probably either watching or participating in sport. And actually there's a role in that, and integration I think is an opportunity that should be grabbed.
Very good. Just pass the microphone.
Hello, Greg Jones, Child Grad and Lewis Architect. I just wanted to make the observation really that we talk about placemaking and use of spaces, particularly between the buildings, in rather esoteric terms. What does it actually mean? And I think we could just do with simplifying it down for people. The first thing it needs is an intent, and that sounds like there's general buy-in at that at a high level. The next thing it needs is the facilities, the infrastructure. And they needn't be particularly complex. We're talking about power for lighting, PAs, wayfinding, storage for market stalls, chairs, equipment, tent. Not vast areas, but needs to be somewhere. And then it needs curating. So somebody needs to take charge of that on a day-to-day. But that's about all we need.
And now, Eamon Boylan, the new Chief Executive of Greater Manchester. The GM question, are we going to see a head of culture in Greater Manchester?
Well, that'll be for the mayor to determine. But I know that the candidates for mayor that I've spoken to all appreciate the importance of culture, and I'm sure that will be reflected in the measures they'll take on appointment.
That's a very considered approach from an answer from somebody who's not yet sure who his new mayor will be. Let us go back across the panel once more with any response to the questions, and then your final word, the last word. What do you want to leave the audience thinking about? We'll start from this side, Stephen.
Just picking up the point on sport, absolutely couldn't agree more with you. It's obviously difficult coming from Bolton and the troubles they're having at the moment. But you can see the difference, you know, when there's a successful sporting offer, what that means in terms of the town, the profile of the town and the interest. So absolutely really, really important. And obviously a place like Bolton, as with Salford and with Manchester, have really strong sporting traditions outside of football.
Yeah, the point around mental health, you know, many arts organisations deliver really life-changing programmes for the most vulnerable people within our communities. It's kind of part of what we see as the day job. You know, it's not sexy, it's not attractive, might not attract investment in its own right, but it doesn't half make sure that those communities feel that those cultural assets are also places for them. So I think that's the first point. I think in terms of, you know, the more general point in terms of finishing, it's just that partnership point, you know, and partnership's really difficult and it takes forever. You know, the fact that I'm here today, 10 years ago, you know, I hadn't made a Faustian pact with any developers, and now I'm sitting here quite comfortably with Mr. Weil from Peel, and, you know, I can tell you I cannot do what I do without the support of Steve and with the local authority, and that's not me playing the partnership mantra game. It's genuine, and those partnerships mean sticking together when times are tough as well as when times are good.
Ian, any comments and last word?
There's certainly no need for Faustian pacts in my business anyway. But I mean, coming back to your point on sport, I think that was the point I was trying to get over. My vision for the use of land at Logistics North Country Park is around things like park run and sort of outdoor sports and so on, which, again, coming back to my point before about Sheffield, Hallam and Waverley, you know, they have a recognised track record of bringing outdoor sports like badminton and so on and making it a bit more accessible for people in developments. So that's what I'd like to see, really. So yeah, I completely agree with your point, because I think that, you know, coming back to your point on mental health, I think it helps that. I think it helps staff retention. I think it helps resident retention. You know, ultimately, Salford and Bolton have both got aspirations to try and keep, you know, high value skilled workforce within the borough, and so, you know, those considerations are always going to be paramount.
Final comment for me is let's incorporate a culture and wellbeing test in every planning application that goes into the planning authority. Make sure it's up there at the top of the agenda, and a stakeholder could be the new head of culture that's coming into Greater Manchester.
Heard it here first.
You heard it here first.
Stephen.
The two questions are massively interlinked. You know, you get the spaces, allow people to use them for the right thing. Don't try and reinvent the wheel. You know, if we're going on Ian's thing, I'm not about to go and run a boot camp, am I? But, there's no reason why the spaces can't be used for that. There's no reason why the water spaces can't be used for open water swimming. You get that community together and they'll drive it. So it's a massively partnership issue here rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. Last thought is culture comes with connotations. We need to break down for the whole breadth of population what culture actually means. It does mean health and well-being and exercise, and it does mean some of the great things Manchester International Festival are doing. It's a complete mix, and the name sometimes sort of isolates people.
Just a couple of things to finish off. I think we heard this morning in the Brexit discussion the globalisation versus nationalism debate that is running, and the huge changes in our cities, I think, is part of this. I think it is a challenge to all of us involved in this level of investment and change in the cities to give this some more serious consideration. So I'd want to put the message out, certainly on behalf of Salford. Don't bring us just planning applications just for buildings with no consideration of what the cultural life is, what the neighbourhood is, what the impact on people's lives is. We're now looking at this as a whole, so we want you as an industry to look at this as a whole as well.
Thank you very much. Just to finish, those of you who've been unlucky enough ever to hear me speak will know I always finish on the same slide. The slide I always finish on is an oath sworn by the citizens of ancient Athens. And before you become a citizen of ancient Athens, you swore this oath, which incidentally you can only do if you're a free man. And the oath was, we shall leave this city not less, but greater, better than we found it, which I think is a great oath. And I think one of the problems we've got working in the built environment is on the private sector, we're quite rightly all focused on return and yield and net to gross. On the public sector, again, quite rightly focused on numbers and delivery, and actually thinking about the quality of life and what we're creating, because the buildings and places we're creating are going to last longer than we last, hopefully. And I think what we've heard today is some really great insight into how we can make our towns, cities and world a slightly better place. So can I thank Stephen, Julia, Ian, Steve, Vac and Sheila very much, and can you show your appreciation in the usual way? Thank you.